2 women, 1 crown, and a king whose love was the most dangerous prize in England. Queen Anne Boleyn had won it all. But in a court of shadows, her brilliance began to cast its own long, dark shadow. And from that shadow, a rival emerged. Quiet, patient, pious. Everything Anne was not. Come, step into the world of their silent battle. And this story begins not with the clash of swords, but with a single drop of blood on white silk. Blood on white silk. A wan dawn crept over the stone flagstones of the bedchamber, painting them a pale gray, an almost spectral hue. Outside the windows, a January fog stood, cutting the room off from the rest of the world. Here, amidst the scent of blood, bitter herbs and damp chill, time itself seemed to have stopped. The fireplace crackled, but its warmth did not reach Anne. It was lost somewhere between the walls, filled with shadows and silence. Anne lay motionless, feeling the sheets cling to her body. A dull ringing filled her head, and in her chest, an emptiness where so much hope had recently beaten. Around her, servants whispered, their voices muffled as if coming through a great depth of water. The midwife, her face weary and stern, bent over her, adjusting the pillows and shaking invisible crumbs of anxiety from her hands. "Your Majesty, do not rise," she whispered. "You must save your strength." Anne tried to remember how it had all happened. The pain, the screams, the hot hands, and the silence. She remembered clinging to the edge of the bed, praying for it all to end well. But now that all was quiet, nothing remained within her but exhaustion and an icy tremor. "A boy?" Her voice sounded hollow, as if from a great distance. The midwife lowered her eyes, and in that silence was the entire answer. Anne felt tears roll down her cheeks, not hot, but cold as ice, like water in a frozen stream. She clutched the sheet, trying to still the trembling, but her hands were as weak as a child's. "Where is the king?" she asked after a long pause. "His Majesty will be notified," the midwife answered cautiously, avoiding her gaze. The words hung in the air, like frost on winter branches. Anne closed her eyes, letting the pain wash over her completely. Everything she had lived for had vanished in a single night. Her son, her hope, her protection. From beyond the chamber walls came the sound of laughter, distant, alien, like an echo from a life to which she no longer belonged. "Mistress Bridges?" she called to the midwife. The woman turned. On her face, Anne read what she dared not name aloud, pity mingled with fear. "What are they saying at court?" "Your Majesty, you should not—" "What are they saying?" Anne repeated more sharply. The midwife glanced down at her hands as if she could still see the traces of the tragedy upon them. "They are saying," she paused, choosing her words, "that the Lord gives signs." Anne gave a bitter, mirthless laugh. Signs, of course. In this palace, any event was instantly turned into a symbol, any coincidence into the will of Providence. A queen's miscarriage could mean only one thing. God had turned his face from her. "And what else are they saying?" she asked, almost in a whisper. The midwife hesitated, then finally resolved to speak. "At court, the servants whisper that the king has changed. They say his gaze lingers more and more often on one of the young ladies in waiting." Anne did not immediately grasp the meaning of these words. Rumors, whispers, idle talk. All this had always surrounded the court, but now as she lay in bed, desolate, these sounds seemed particularly vicious. She felt an anxiety, barely perceptible, begin to creep slowly into her consciousness. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "Let them talk." There was no strength in her voice, no conviction, only weariness. The midwife nodded, adjusted the blanket, and left, leaving Anne alone amidst the shadows and the scent of herbs. Anne lay there, staring at the ceiling where the dim reflections of the fire danced. Pain and despair slowly gave way to something else, something cold and clear, like the January air outside. She knew she could not afford weakness. Not in this palace. Not now. Ahead lay only the unknown, and she had to meet it on her feet, not lying in her bed. The king's silence? Days passed. The snow outside the windows gave way to a dank gray, and the silence in the queen's chambers grew thick and ringing. Finally, gathering the last of her strength, Anne decided to act. The evening throne room was filled with cold and emptiness. The marble reflected the trembling candlelight, and the echo of her footsteps sounded too loud in the stillness. Henry stood by a window, his back to her, as if her presence meant nothing. Anne stopped, gathering the remnants of her dignity. She waited for a word, a look, even a gesture, but the king continued to stare into the gathering dusk. "Henry!" she called softly. He turned slowly. His face was calm, almost indifferent. "How are you feeling?" "I will endure," she answered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Good." He nodded and looked away again. A silence fell between them, heavy as lead. Anne tried to speak, of their loss, of hope, but the words caught in her throat. Henry listened distractedly, as if his mind were on something far away. At that moment, by the far wall, among a group of ladies-in-waiting, the figure of Jane Seymour flickered. A pale face, downcast eyes, hands folded at her breast. She stood slightly apart, not joining in the conversations, but Anne caught how Henry's gaze lingered on her longer than on the others. There was nothing accidental or indifferent in that look. Henry, noticing that Anne was following his gaze, spoke a little quieter, hardly looking at his wife. "Sometimes, among the ladies-in-waiting, one finds those who bring peace and light into these walls. Miss Seymour, for example." The name was spoken almost casually, but for Anne it was a blow. What had been a vague fear now had a face and a name. She felt something in her chest tighten painfully. She did not answer. Henry returned to his papers, as if she were merely a shadow that had lingered too long in the hall. Anne stood for a few seconds, feeling that behind her was not a husband, but a stranger, and the hollow echo of her footsteps carried the resonance of impending catastrophe. If you enjoy this story and want to hear more about forgotten destinies and royal intrigues, subscribe. There are many more fascinating stories ahead. The Spectre's Arrival. In the great hall, where the air was thick with the scent of rosewater, wine, and roasted meat, life pulsed with an almost defiant vitality. Sunbeams, pouring through the high windows, gilded the faces of the courtiers, and it seemed that spring itself had entered these walls to remind all of the transience of earthly things. Music flowed smoothly, streaming across the marble floor, and every chord, every laugh, every movement was imbued with a frivolity and joy alien to the inner world of Anne Boleyn. She stood by a pillar in the half-shadow, observing this festival of life, which seemed to be taking place on the other side of a river, separated from her by a clear but insurmountable water. Inside her, all was still, as if her heart had stopped beating the day she lost her son. Now, amidst the laughter and music, her soul responded only to the anxious, barely perceptible signals of danger. On this day, the courtiers were especially resplendent. The ladies flaunted new gowns adorned with pearls and gold embroidery, the men velvet doublets that smelled of musk and fresh leather. But no one was so invisible and yet so noticeable at once as Jane Seymour. Jane appeared in the hall almost unnoticed, like a shadow gliding along a wall. Her dress was simple but impeccably clean, her face pale, almost translucent, her eyes downcast. She was the very embodiment of modesty, and in this modesty lay a subtle power that Anne felt the moment she looked at her. Jane moved cautiously, as if afraid to disturb another's peace, but men involuntarily turned to look as she passed. She did not laugh, did not try to draw attention to herself, but it was precisely this that attracted their gazes. There was a studied simplicity in her gestures that Anne found suspicious. Anne watched her like a hunter stalking its prey, and suddenly she caught a familiar gesture. Jane, passing by the king, accidentally dropped a glove. Henry, without a second thought, picked it up and, smiling, returned it to the girl. Their gazes met. Briefly, but in that glance was everything, a game, a challenge, a promise. Anne felt everything inside her clench. She recognized in Jane her former self, the one who had once stood by the walls while Queen Catherine failed to notice the threat. Now, she herself was in Catherine's place, and the realization was agonizing. At that moment, the laughter in the hall seemed deafening to her, the music alien and false. The threat, until now faceless and distant, had acquired a name, and that name was Jane Seymour. The game of virtue. A shifting twilight reigned in Anne's chambers, where the candlelight flared and died with the breath of the draught. The heavy draperies kept out the night's chill, yet the room was filled with a damp, clammy cold, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the anxiety of recent weeks. The scent of lavender and old parchment mingled with the smoke from the fireplace, where the logs were burning down, crackling in time with their mistress's troubled thoughts. Anne was sitting at her desk, sifting through letters, when the door creaked softly. Jane appeared on the threshold, hesitantly, as if afraid to disturb the silence. "Your Majesty," her voice was barely audible, like the whisper of a draft. "Forgive me for disturbing you so late." Anne did not invite her to sit, nor did she bid her to come closer. She watched Jane with a cold, studious wariness, like a cat watching a mouse, but in no hurry to pounce. "To what do I owe so late a visit?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the girl's face. Jane faltered, her eyes dropping even lower, as if seeking support from her own shoes. I came to apologize," she finally managed. "There are rumors that I seek the king's favor. It is not true, I swear it. It pains me to hear such talk." Anne smiled, a thin, almost invisible smile that held more coldness than the March wind outside the window. "Rumors always follow young and beautiful girls at court," she said, turning a letter in her hands as if it were a dagger. "You should not take them to heart, especially if there is no truth in them." Jane looked up. There was no fear in her eyes, only caution and something else, barely perceptible, like the glint of steel beneath lace. "I pray for you every day, Your Majesty, especially for your health," she said, and her voice grew a fraction firmer. A silence filled with hidden tension hung in the room. Anne felt everything clench inside her. That phrase was not mere courtesy. It was a challenge, subtle, almost imperceptible, but felt like an icy touch on the skin. "Thank you," she said, trying to speak evenly, but her voice had a steel edge. "I will have need of your prayers, Miss Seymour. Not everyone is granted the strength to endure trials." Jane bowed her head. There was submission in her gesture, but in her eyes a shadow of stubbornness, fleeting as a ghost in the half-light. "I wish you only well," she added quietly. Anne did not reply. She looked at the girl as if at a riddle she could not solve, feeling a wave of anxiety and irritation rise within her. Jane left as quietly as she had entered, leaving behind the scent of rosewater and a sense of unease, as if a cold wind had just swept through the room. When the door closed, Anne sat motionless for a long time, staring at the trembling shadows on the wall. She understood. This meeting had not been a mere conversation. It had been the first move in a game where not only love, but life itself was at stake. Inside her, fear and fury, pride and despair did battle, and every emotion echoed painfully in her chest. A gift with a message. Spring burst into the palace with a riot of light and warmth, but a chill reigned in the Queen's chambers. Anne sat before her mirror while her ladies-in-waiting tightened the laces of her gown. Her gaze was distant. She was not looking at her reflection, but through it. This morning, during the falconry hunt, she had been by the king's side. She had laughed, trying to recapture their old ease. And for a moment, it seemed the ice between them had begun to thaw. It was at that very moment that Henry, laughing loudly at a courtier's jest, threw his head back. The collar of his hunting doublet fell open, and on his chest, on a thin gold chain, a locket flashed into view. Enamel glinted in the sun, and Anne, standing very close, managed to make out the finely painted face, pale with a meek gaze, the face of Jane Seymour. No one else seemed to notice. Henry immediately adjusted his collar, but for Anne the world stood still. The cheerful laughter, the cries of the falcons, the sunlight, all faded. She saw not just a gift, she saw a symbol, a token that the king wore next to his heart. Now, in her own chambers, she still felt the icy touch of that discovery. "Enough!" she said sharply to her ladies. "Leave me!" When the door closed behind the servants, Anne rose and went straight to the king's study. She carried herself with royal dignity, but a storm raged within her. Henry was sitting at a desk cluttered with maps and dispatches. He looked up at her, and there was no surprise in his eyes, only a dull irritation, as if he had been expecting this visit and was already weary of it. "I am busy, Anne." "I will not take much of your time." Her voice was deceptively calm. She walked to the desk and stopped opposite him. "I only wished to ask if the hunt went well. Did you enjoy yourself? It seemed to me you were in a particularly good mood this morning. Perhaps because of your new ornament?" She paused, looking him directly in the eyes. "It suits you very well. So close to your heart." His face turned to stone, his hands resting on the desk, clenched into fists. "You go too far." "I?" Steel rang in her voice and her composure shattered like a mask. "I go too far when my husband, the King of England, wears a portrait of my lady-in-waiting on his chest, making a mockery of me before the entire court." "Enough!" he roared, leaping to his feet. The desk trembled, the inkwell teetered. "I am the king, and I will not answer to you or to anyone for my actions." "You pursued me for 7 years!" she cried out, her voice a mixture of fury and despair. "For 7 years you swore your eternal love to me. You overturned a kingdom for me. And for what? To trade me now for this faceless, empty creature with those vacant sheep's eyes? She, unlike you, knows the meaning of modesty and peace," his voice thundered. "She does not make scenes. She does not meddle in affairs of state. She is a woman who knows her place." Every word was a blow. Anne recoiled as if from a physical slap. The rage inside her died in an instant, replaced by an icy, all-consuming fear. She looked at his face, distorted with anger, and realized that this was not her Henry, not the man she had loved and controlled. This was a dangerous stranger, a king whose will she no longer commanded. "So that is the price," she whispered, all strength gone from her voice. "A crown in exchange for silence." She turned in silence and walked to the door. Her gait was slow and unsteady, as if she had suddenly aged 10 years. She had lost, not just an argument. She had lost the battle for his heart, for her future. And now, she was utterly alone. A game of chess on a board of blood. The light of the spring morning gradually gave way to a soft dusk, and the palace garden paths were shrouded in a cool air. Anne, still feeling the weight of the morning's conversation, walked out to a gazebo, where the air was filled with the fragrance of blooming roses and fresh earth. A light breeze played with her cloak as if trying to carry away her bitterness and anxiety. She sat on a stone bench, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath, trying to calm the raging thoughts within. But there was no peace. The fury had subsided, leaving only a cold fear in its wake. At that moment, Thomas Cromwell approached her. His arrival was quiet, almost unnoticed, but his gaze was sharp and attentive. He stopped a few steps away, bowed slightly, and his voice was even, without undue emotion. "Your Majesty, I have taken the liberty of disturbing you, as I consider it my duty to serve the crown." Anne opened her eyes and looked at him, trying to read something more behind the mask of politeness. "I am listening, Master Cromwell." "They are saying at court that the Lord has turned his face from you." Anne gave a bitter laugh. "Rumors are the lot of those who envy my position." Cromwell smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "When the king believes in rumors, they cease to be rumors. They become grounds for action." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The king needs an heir, Your Majesty." England needs an heir, and many believe you are no longer capable of providing one." Something inside Anne clenched, a cold knot of fear. She realized Jane was merely a facade, a pretext. Behind her stood calculating politicians, and Cromwell was one of them. "What are you trying to say?" she asked directly. "I am trying to say," his voice became almost paternal, and yet all the more sinister for it, "that the king can be given what he wants by other means. A new marriage, a new law, for the good of England. I came to warn you. Be careful. Your enemies are powerful, and they are making their move." Cromwell bowed and departed as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Anne alone in the evening twilight. She stood in the garden where the scarlet roses seemed like drops of fresh blood on the green grass. The weight of his words hung in the air, a harbinger of the coming storm. She was no longer fighting for her husband's love. Now she was fighting for her life. The Last Dance. In the great ballroom of the palace, where Anne Boleyn had once shone at the center of attention, an atmosphere of festive cheer reigned, but it was a cheer tinged with an anxious falseness. Hundreds of candles were reflected in the polished surfaces, music poured from the stage, and the courtiers swirled in a dance, as if wanting to forget the gathering storm. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, wine, and freshly cut flowers, but for Anne, it was all just scenery, behind which her loneliness was hidden. She stood by a pillar, observing the proceedings, feeling like a guest at her own celebration. Her gown, once an object of admiration, today seemed too bright, too conspicuous, like a target. In the eyes of those around her, she read not admiration, but pity, or worse, indifference. Everyone knew the Queen was losing her place. Henry was in the center of the hall, surrounded by courtiers, but his attention was fixed on Jane Seymour. Jane looked especially modest today, a pale gown, an almost girlish hairstyle, her gaze downcast, though a smile occasionally touched her lips when the king addressed her. Anne watched as Henry, making no secret of it, offered Jane his hand, inviting her to dance. The scene was agonizingly humiliating, not only because of the public neglect, but because there was no fear or embarrassment in Jane's eyes, only a quiet, confident resolve. The music grew louder, the laughter and applause merging into a single torrent, but for Anne, everything was happening as if in a fog. She saw only them, Henry and Jane, their movements, their glances, their barely perceptible touches. Every gesture was a challenge, every look a sentence. She felt a despair rising within her, turning into a dull rage. At one point, Henry, laughing, turned to the courtiers and loudly proposed a toast to purity and virtue, looking directly at Jane. The courtiers laughed, some clapped, others cast glances at Anne, some with sympathy, others with unconcealed malice. She felt a flush of heat rise to her face, her heart clenching with humiliation. In that instant, their eyes met, Anne's gaze full of fire and pain, and Jane's, in which there was neither triumph nor pity, only a cold, almost mechanical determination. The music stopped, and the hall filled with applause. Henry, beaming, led Jane from the circle of dancers and, without releasing her hand, addressed the courtiers. "Let every man take her as his example," he exclaimed. "Modesty and obedience, these are the virtues worthy of a queen." The words were like a verdict. The hall fell silent for a moment, all eyes turning to Anne. She felt her legs give way, but she forced herself to stand straight. She would not let them see her weakness. Without looking back, oblivious to the frozen faces, she slowly crossed the hall. The click of her heels on the marble was the only sound in the sudden silence. When the door closed behind her, the hall erupted once more with music and laughter, even louder than before. In the empty, cold corridor, she finally leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Humiliation burned like a fire in her chest. The battle for the king was lost, but the fight for her own destiny, for her place in this world, was only just beginning. She clenched her fists until her palms ached. She did not know what tomorrow would bring: disgrace, exile, or a new, even more brutal battle. But she was not going to surrender. Not now. Not like this. The Queen's arrest. The 2nd of May, 1536, was a deceptively clear day. In the Queen's private chambers, where sunbeams played on the tapestries, a tense silence reigned. Anne sat with a few of her ladies-in-waiting, but neither embroidery nor conversation could dispel the anxiety that had thickened in the palace in recent days. The door opened without a knock, but it was not guards who entered. On the threshold stood a delegation of Privy Council members. At their head, his face as impenetrable as granite, was her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Behind him, she could see the figures of other councillors and the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston. The ladies-in-waiting started in fear and curtsied deeply. Anne rose slowly. Her heart skipped a beat, but outwardly she remained calm. The presence of her uncle at the head of this procession spoke volumes. "Uncle." Her voice was even, but with a barely perceptible note of coldness. "To what do I owe such a sudden visit from the entire council?" Norfolk did not even flinch. He looked at her with a cold, detached gaze, as if seeing not a niece, but a traitor to the state. "We have come on the King's order to escort you to the Tower of London." A dead silence fell upon the room. The ladies-in-waiting froze, afraid to breathe. For Anne, the world momentarily shrank to that single word, the Tower, spoken by her own uncle. It was the end of her world. The shock was so profound that she felt neither anger nor fear, only an icy emptiness. She looked at Norfolk's stern face and saw a death sentence in it. She was silent for several long seconds, gathering the remnants of her will. She would not let them see her broken. If this was the end, she would meet it as the queen she had been. She inclined her head slightly, and in that gesture was more royal dignity than in the entire delegation before her. "If it is His Majesty's wish," she said slowly and distinctly, looking her uncle directly in the eye, "I am ready to obey." Norfolk gave a short nod as if concluding a business transaction. "You are to come with us, immediately." She was given no time to gather her belongings, nor to bid farewell to her ladies. She simply rose and followed them, leaving behind her chambers, her life, her past. She walked through the corridors, escorted not by guards, but by the very men who had bowed to her only yesterday. In one of the passages, by a high window flooded with sunlight, she saw a lone figure. It was Jane Seymour. She stood motionless, her hands clasped at her breast. Their gazes met for one brief moment over the heads of the councillors. There was no triumph or malice in Jane's eyes, only a quiet fear and, perhaps, a shadow of compassion. Anne did not look away. There was no hatred in her gaze, only an icy void and the bitter knowledge of a fate that now perhaps awaited them both. No one said a word. The procession moved on, leaving Jane behind, a solitary statue in a sunbeam. When they reached the river, where a covered barge awaited at the quay, she did not look back. She knew there was nothing left to look back on. The barge that had once carried her to her coronation now bore her away to uncertainty, humiliation, and death. Epilogue: The New Queen. The same courtyard, several weeks later. The day was bright and festive, the air filled with music, laughter, and the scent of fresh flowers. Greenwich Palace was transformed. Fountains were adorned with ribbons, servants scurried along the paths with trays, and courtiers in their finest attire discussed the latest news. At the center of attention was Jane Seymour. She wore a new gown, with pearls in her hair, and a demure smile on her face. She accepted congratulations, curtsied, and returned greetings, but her gaze lacked its former serenity. It was now the gaze of a woman who fully understood the price of her victory. Henry was by her side, beaming, holding her hand as if to show the entire court. Here is the new queen, the new hope, the new order. Courtiers hurried to pay their respects, some whispering compliments, others cautious warnings. Jane smiled, but deep in her eyes was a shadow of anxiety. At one point she stopped. her gaze sweeping over the courtyard, lingering on the very spot by the stairs where she had last seen Anne. In that instant, the music grew quieter, and Jane could hear only the beating of her own heart. For a moment, she thought she saw a familiar silhouette in the crowd, a slender figure in a dark dress, a proud posture, a quick glance. But it was only a trick of light and shadow, a ghost left behind in memory. Jane took a deep breath, adjusting the pearls at her neck, a gesture she had so often seen Anne make, and in that moment she felt an icy chill. The throne beneath her was unstable, a king's love was fickle, and the fate of a queen was to always be on the edge, to always remember the price of power. Henry said something cheerful in her ear, and she nodded, but his words were lost in the festive noise. Everything around them seemed a celebration, but for Jane this day was only the beginning of a new struggle, where not just a crown, but life itself was at stake. At that moment, the sun emerged from behind the clouds, and for an instant, the courtyard was bathed in a dazzling light. Jane raised her head, meeting the light with an open face, but in her soul echoed a quiet refrain, the memory of the one whose place she had taken, and a clear premonition of her own brief fate. The celebration continued, music once again filling the courtyard, flowers scattering at the new queen's feet. But in this splendor, a new shadow was already growing, the shadow of history, which spares no one who dares to ascend the throne. If you enjoy experiencing history through storytelling, make sure to subscribe. Many more fascinating tales await. This story is inspired by real events but includes elements of artistic fiction. Up next, you will see a list of historical facts that formed its foundation.